Vesta Cole carried 2 heavy wooden pails of pale butcher's waste fat out through Corwin Lutz's back door on the second Tuesday of April in 1874 in the cattle trail town of Salt Fork, Kansas, and paid him 2 cents a pail for trimmings every soul in town agreed were garbage. Behind her, 3 men loafing on the bench outside the feed store caught sight of the pails swinging from her hands and started laughing before she had crossed half the alley, Grover Tice hollering that Vesta Cole had finally found something in Salt Fork, poorer than she was. The pails held nothing worse than cold, trimmed fat, pale as tallow candles, and no more dangerous than a crock of lard. No blood on the wire bales, none on her apron, nothing about the load that should have earned a single word of comment from 3 grown men with idle hands and a whole morning to fill. Grover Tice worked, when he worked at all, hauling freight for whoever paid him that week, and the 2 men flanking him on the bench had nothing better to occupy a Tuesday than watch whoever walked past and decide, out loud, what they thought of her business. It was not the fat itself that struck them as funny. It was the 2 cents. A woman spending money, however little, on something the whole town had always simply thrown away, struck Salt Fork that particular April as the funniest thing anyone had done in weeks. She did not set the pails down, and she did not turn around. She walked the width of Front Street with a pail in each hand, and the wire bales cutting faint lines into her palms through her gloves, and she let the laughter run itself out behind her the way she let most things in Salt Fork run themselves out, because arguing with a bench full of idle men had never once put a coin in anyone's hand. And she had exactly 4 cents left in her apron pocket after paying Corwin Lutz for the 2 pails she carried. 4 cents. And a debt of $22.50 standing against her name in Wendell Sharp's account book at the general store, due whole and in coin on the 1st of November, 6.5 months off. She had not told a living soul in Salt Fork what she meant to do with 2 pails of rendered beef and hog trimmings that Corwin Lutz had, until 3 weeks earlier, been paying a boy 50 cents a week to cart out to the edge of town, because she had learned, in 29 years of being underestimated by people who had never once had to count a debt down to the day it came due, that a plan spoken out loud before it worked was a plan handed over free of charge to every person waiting for the chance to laugh at it. She meant to keep this one to herself a while longer, long enough to see whether it worked, long enough that when the whole county finally did find out, there would be nothing left for them to do but watch. If you are the kind of listener who likes a number that refuses to add up until, quietly, it does, this is a story built for exactly you. Tap the like button before you go any further. And tell me down in the comments what state or country you are hearing this from tonight, because I do read every one of them. Now let's go back to that Tuesday morning in April, because 2 pails of waste fat and 4 cents in an apron pocket is only the first line of what Vesta Cole was about to write into her ledger. Salt Fork sat where the old cattle road out of Texas crossed a wide, shallow, sand-bottomed river that gave the town its name, a huddle of clapboard storefronts and sod-roofed houses that swelled twice a year, spring and fall, with the noise and dust and hollering of longhorn herds pushed north toward the railroad and settled back the rest of the time into the quieter business of the 300 or 400 people who actually called it home. It had one main street worth naming, Front Street, and on it stood Wendell Sharp's general store, Corwin Lutz's meat market, a feed store, a harness shop, 2 saloons that did most of their business during drive season and dozed the rest of the year, and a scatter of houses running back from the street toward the river on one side and the open, wind-combed prairie on the other. Spring came to that stretch of Kansas the way it came to most of the cattle trail country, arriving in fits, a week of soft, green-smelling warmth followed by a hard, late frost that killed the garden starts and reminded everyone how far they still stood from anything resembling comfort. The wind rarely stopped entirely. It was, most days, simply a question of which direction it blew from, and how hard, and a person learned, living in Red Wing County long enough, to read the sky the way she read a ledger, for the small signs that told her what the coming week actually intended to do, regardless of what the almanac had promised. Vesta Cole's house sat on the prairie side, a small frame house with a lean-to kitchen and a fenced dooryard, rented from Wendell Sharp at $4 a month, on a corner lot at the edge of town where the wind came in off open grass with nothing to slow it for 11 miles. She was not yet 30. She had come to Salt Fork 4 years earlier from a played-out farm in Missouri with her mother's cedar trunk, a good iron kettle, and very little else, and had built, in the years since, a small and entirely respectable trade as the town's laundress, the woman who took in washing for the storekeepers' families who could afford to pay someone else to do it, for the 2 hotels that served drive season, and when the herds came through, for whatever trail crew happened to be camped near enough to town to spare a man to carry the bundle in and the coin to pay for it. It was not an elegant trade. It was hot, wet, back-breaking work that started before daylight and did not end until the last line of shirts came in off the fence at dusk, and it paid on a good week during drive season, perhaps $6 or $7, and on a slow week in deep winter, perhaps nothing at all. A washing day for Vesta began before the sun cleared the eastern grass and did not end until well past dark. She hauled water from the town well 2 streets over in a yoke across her shoulders, 20 trips some mornings, filled her 2 big tubs and the copper boiler, built a fire under the boiler hot enough to keep the water at a hard simmer through the worst of the grease and trail dirt, and worked through the day in the particular rhythm every laundress in every cattle town on the frontier knew by feel rather than by counting. Scrub, wring, boil, rinse, wring again, hang, and start the next load before the first had finished drying. Her hands raw and reddened by noon regardless of the season, the yard behind her house strung end to end with other people's shirts and linens snapping in the prairie wind. It was honest work, and it paid honest money, and not 1 minute of it had ever once struck her as beneath her, whatever certain men on certain benches liked to imply about a woman who earned her living over a washtub instead of a husband's wage. She kept a ledger for it. A real one, cloth-bound, bought for 35 cents from Sharp's own shelf 4 years before, and in it she had written down, in her own small and careful hand, every dollar that had come into her hands and every dollar that had gone back out of them since the week she arrived in Kansas, because she had found, the way some people find a whim or a habit, that she trusted a column of numbers a great deal further than she trusted most people's memory of what they had told her, her own memory included. She had heard doubt before this particular spring, plenty of it. When she had first hung her sign, a plain board reading V. Cole, washing done, nailed to her own gatepost the week she arrived, 2 of the town's more established matrons had predicted within her hearing that a woman alone would not last a single Kansas winter running any trade by herself, let alone one that required hauling her own water and tending her own fire from 4 in the morning. She had lasted 4 winters. She had not forgotten the prediction, only set it aside the way she set aside most predictions made about her by people who had never once had to make their own numbers balance, filed alongside a quiet certainty that the same doubt would greet whatever she tried next, soap included, and that the only real answer to it had ever been the same one. Finish the thing, and let the ledger argue on her behalf. It was that ledger, on a cold evening in late March, that had shown her something she had known in a vague way for a long time, and had never once let herself look at squarely. She had been going back through the winter's entries, tallying what she owed against what she had, because the note to Sharp would come due whenever November decided to arrive, whether she was ready for it or not, and there in her own handwriting, entry after entry through the cold months, was the same short line repeated 11 times. Soap, Sharp's store, 10 cents, 11 bars since the first frost. $1.10 of a debt she was fighting with both hands to bring down, spent buying back, at 10 cents a cake, something she went through a bar of nearly every week of her working life, because a laundress without soap was not a laundress at all. She was simply a woman standing over a tub of dirty water for no reason anyone would pay her for. She added it forward, the way she added most things forward once a thought like that got its hook into her. 11 bars in the cold months alone. Across a whole year, closer to 40, most weeks needing at least 3/4 of a cake between the washtub and the boiling copper, more during drive season when the trail crews sent in shirts caked with a summer's dust, and worse. 40 bars at 10 cents was $4 and change. $4.20 of her own hard-earned money walked straight back across Sharp's counter every year for something that came into Salt Fork on the same freight wagons as his coffee and his calico, shipped up from Kansas City at a price that had nothing to do with what the thing was actually worth and everything to do with what it cost to haul it 400 miles over bad road. $4.20 was not the whole of what she owed Wendell Sharp. It was not even most of it. But it sat in her ledger like a burr under a saddle blanket, because unlike the flour and the coal oil and the thread, all of which she genuinely needed and could not make herself, soap was, in its bones, nothing but fat and ashes and water and time. She knew that the way she knew most useful things she knew, which is to say she had been told it once, long ago, by someone who no longer had any use for the knowledge herself. Her grandmother, back in Missouri, had made soap every spring of Vesta's childhood in a big black kettle set up over an open fire behind the smokehouse, and Vesta, 6 or 7 years old, had been allowed to stand well back and watch the whole operation the way a child watches anything that involves fire, a large adult stirring paddle, and the strict promise of being sent inside if she came one step closer. She remembered the smell of it, sharp and strange. Not unpleasant exactly, just insistent, carrying on the wind for a 1/4 mile. She remembered a barrel of ashes standing in the yard with water dripping slow and steady from a hole bored in its base into a stone crock beneath, and her grandmother testing that drip water by floating an egg in it, the old woman's face going satisfied when the egg bobbed up just so. She remembered rows of pale, hard, sweet-smelling bars laid out afterward on boards in the spring house, more soap than one family could use in a year, some of it traded off to neighbors for things the farm didn't grow. She had not thought about any of it in 15 years. She thought about it now, sitting at her own kitchen table with her own ledger open in front of her and 11 entries reading soap, 10 cents staring back up at her like an accusation. She remembered, too, though this piece came back to her more slowly, sitting at her own table that evening, the one time her grandmother had let her closer than the customary safe distance. The summer Vesta turned 11, old enough by her grandmother's reckoning to be trusted with a long-handled paddle and a warning repeated twice. Stir from the far side, never lean over the kettle, and if the mixture spits, step back before you wipe your face, not after. She had stirred for perhaps 10 minutes that single summer, arms aching, proud beyond all proportion to the actual labor, and her grandmother had watched her without a word until she judged the trace right, then taken the paddle back without a hint of doubting the girl's effort, only a plain, practical sense that the next part required a surer hand. Vesta had not resented it then. She understood it perfectly now. 18 years later, standing at the edge of exactly the same kind of judgment about her own two capable hands. It might have stayed a memory and nothing more, the way most childhood memories do, if she had not, 3 days after that evening with the ledger, walked past the open back door of Corwin Lutz's meat market on her way to collect a bundle of washing from the Drover's Rest Hotel, and seen a boy of perhaps 12 tipping a wheelbarrow load of pale, waxy trimmed fat over the edge of the hog lot fence at the far end of the alley, the way she had seen him do, without ever once really looking at it, most weeks for the past 4 years. She stopped. She stood in the alley a moment longer than she had any real reason to, watching fat that had cost Corwin Lutz nothing and was now costing him 50 cents a week just to be rid of, disappear over a fence to feed hogs that did not particularly need feeding. and she did the arithmetic that would end up changing the shape of the next year of her life, standing there in the dust with a laundry bundle balanced on one hip. Fat that was worth nothing to Lutz, and ashes that were worth nothing to anyone in Salt Fork who kept a hearth, could, by her grandmother's method, become the very thing that was eating $4.20 a year out of her own ledger, a thing that people all over Red Wing County bought whether times were good or bad, because nobody, however poor, went entirely without soap. She did not go to Corwin Lutz that afternoon. She went home first, and she sat up later than she should have with a stub of pencil, working the numbers 3 different ways to see if any of them broke down under a harder look. A pail of trimmed fat, she reasoned, watching the boy in her memory tip that wheelbarrow ought to be worth something to Lutz over nothing at all, and worth a great deal less to her than the finished soap it could become. Ashes cost her nothing but the asking. Half the households in Salt Fork would be glad to have someone haul their cold hearth ash away instead of shoveling it out back themselves. The only true unknowns were whether she remembered her grandmother's method well enough to make it work, and whether, having made it, she could sell what she made for more than it cost her to make it. And on that second question, she already had $4.20 of her own money as proof that somebody in this county would pay a dime a bar without blinking. She went to see Corwin Lutz 2 days later, on a Sunday, catching him at his own back door with his sleeves down and his apron off, and she asked him, plainly, whether he would sell her his waste fat instead of paying a boy to haul it away, and how much he would want for it. Lutz was a big, soft-spoken man with a gray-flecked beard and a dry, unhurried way of talking that had made him, over 15 years behind that counter, one of the few men in Salt Fork whose jokes nobody minded. He looked at her for a long moment, the way a man looks at a question he was not expecting on a Sunday afternoon, and then he laughed, not unkindly, and said he supposed he could manage 2 cents a pail, seeing as it was 2 cents more than the fat was presently earning him, and a good deal less than the 50 cents a week he paid to have it hauled off to Hollis Dre's hog lots. "I won't ask you what you want it for," he told her, wiping his hands on a rag, though they were already clean. "On account of I expect I wouldn't believe the answer if you gave it to me straight." "That's fair," Vesta said. "I'm not sure I'd believe it myself yet." Lutz considered her a moment longer, curiosity getting the better of his usual reserve. "Your grandmother back in Missouri, was it soap she made? My own mother kept a hopper going every spring back before we came west. Never did care for the smell of it myself, but I never once saw her buy a bar from a store in 40 years. "Something like that," Vesta said. "We'll see if I remember it as well as she did." He laughed again at that, a real laugh, and told her to come by Tuesday mornings after the week's cutting was done and the trimmings had a chance to cool, and he'd have pails ready for her at 2 cents apiece, as many as she cared to carry. So it was that on the second Tuesday of April, with $4.20 of soap debt sitting in her ledger and $22.50 of total debt sitting over her head with a due date attached to it, Vesta Cole walked to the back door of Corwin Lutz's meat market, paid him 12 cents for 6 pails of pale waste fat that every soul in Salt Fork would have told her, if she had asked a single one of them, was worth exactly nothing at all, and carried the first 2 of those pails home past a bench full of laughing men, without once slowing her step. She did not know yet, walking home that morning with fat swinging heavy at the ends of her arms, precisely how she would turn it into soap that could stand beside anything shipped up from Kansas City. She did not know that within the year, stores in 3 towns across 40 miles of prairie would be sending riders out to her gate asking for more than she could make. She only knew that she had 4 cents left in her pocket, a debt with a date on it, and a memory of her grandmother's kettle that she intended to test against the hardest judge she knew. Her own ledger, kept honest, 1 entry at a time. That evening, she opened the cloth-bound book to a fresh page, dipped her pen, and wrote across the top of it, in the same small, careful hand she used for everything. soap venture, begun this 14th day of April, 1874. Beneath it, 6 pails waste fat, Lutz's, 12 cents. She left the rest of the page blank, the way she always did when she did not yet know what else belonged on it, and blew out the lamp, already turning over in her mind where in the dooryard she would need to set an ash barrel, and how soon she could start asking her neighbors to save her their cold hearth ashes instead of scattering them out back the way they always had. The ash hopper cost her, by her own careful reckoning, 17 cents and 1 Saturday afternoon, and she would not have managed even that much without Hollis Dray. Dray kept the hog lots at the north edge of town, a broad, weathered, unhurried man well past 50 who freighted goods along the Salt Fork Road when a wagon needed running and asked no questions of anyone who paid him fare, and who had, for reasons Vesta never fully got out of him, simply appeared at her fence on the Saturday after her first walk home from Lutz's with a cracked flour barrel on the back of his wagon and an offer to bore the drain hole himself if she'd feed him a slice of pie for the trouble. She suspected his wife Cressa, who took in Vesta's mending on slow weeks and had a sharper eye for a good idea than anyone else in Salt Fork, had sent him. She did not ask. She simply thanked him, found a knife for the pie, and by the end of that Saturday had a proper ash hopper standing in the corner of her dooryard nearest the kitchen door. It was not complicated as a piece of equipment went, which was precisely why it had survived 100 years of frontier kitchens with almost no change at all. The flour barrel stood on a low wooden cradle Dray had knocked together from scrap fence rail, raised 1.5 feet off the ground so a stone crock could sit beneath the small hole he had bored near its base. Inside, Vesta laid a bed of clean straw and a scattering of twigs across the bottom, thick enough to strain the ash without choking the drain hole, and above that she began, over the following 2 weeks, to fill the barrel with hardwood ashes. Her own hearth first, then her neighbors, who were, exactly as she had predicted, glad enough to have someone cart the cold ash away instead of shoveling it out back themselves. She was particular about what she took. Oak and hickory ash, from the cordwood most households in Red Wing County burned all winter, made a strong, reliable lye. The thin gray ash of cottonwood and other soft prairie wood, burned thin and quick in a fire, made a weaker one, and she learned to ask, before she carted a bucket away, what kind of wood had gone into the stove that had made it. Cressa Dray gave her the ash from 2 winters' worth of a good oak-burning stove without being asked twice. The Whitcombs, 3 houses down, kept a hickory pile specifically for their smokehouse and had more spent ash than they knew what to do with. Even Wendell Sharp's own household, once his wife heard what Vesta wanted it for, sent word by their hired girl that she was welcome to haul away anything from their kitchen hearth, provided she didn't track cinders across the store's front step on her way past. By the end of April, Vesta had stopped asking around town entirely. People had simply begun setting a bucket of cold ash by their back gate on Mondays, the way they might leave out a rag rug for beating, and she made her collection rounds the same morning she collected washing, one errand folded neatly inside the other. The first attempt at packing the ashes taught her something the barrel itself could not have told her simply by standing there. She filled it too tightly the first afternoon, tamping the ash down hard the way she tamped a barrel of flour to save space, and when she poured her first test dipper of water over the top, it sat on the surface a long while and went nowhere, refusing to drain even after an hour's patient waiting. Hollis Dray, back to check his own drain hole was holding, took one look, worked a wooden stake down through the packed ash in 4 or 5 places to open channels for the water to follow, and told her, in the mild, unhurried way he delivered most of his opinions, that ash wanted to breathe the same as a body did, and that packing it down tight was a mistake most everybody made exactly once. She did not make it twice. The second filling she left looser, settled naturally rather than tamped, and the water moved through it steadily from that point on. The first real trial came on the last Sunday in April, with the hopper filled near to the brim and the whole household, meaning Vesta, and, from a respectful distance, a barn cat she had never quite decided whether she owned, waiting to see whether her grandmother's 15-year-old lesson still held any water. She poured rainwater from her cistern slowly over the top of the packed ashes, a dipperful at a time, patient about it, because pouring too fast simply ran the water through without giving it time to draw the strength out of the ash. And by evening, the first thin, brownish trickle had begun to work its way down through 17 inches of packed hardwood ash and out through Dre's bored hole into the waiting crock. By the next morning, there was better than a gallon of it sitting there, the color of strong tea, smelling faintly sharp in a way that caught at the back of the throat if she leaned too close. She tested it the way her grandmother had, with an egg from her own 6 hens. In plain water, a fresh egg sinks straight to the bottom and lies there. Vesta dropped one into the crock of ash lye and watched it settle, turn once, and rise, coming to rest floating with a portion the size of an old $quarter showing dry above the surface. That, as near as she could remember the old woman's rule, was exactly right. Strong enough to cut fat into soap, not so strong it would eat the egg to nothing, or blister a bare hand that touched it carelessly. She tried the same crock a second way, for her own satisfaction more than anything, drawing a feather from an old pillow tick and dipping the tip of it into the liquid. Within a few minutes, the fine barbs along the feather's edge had begun to dissolve and soften, which her grandmother had always taken as the same answer from a different direction. 2 tests, 1 answer. She wrote it in the ledger that evening in 4 words that meant a great deal more to her than they would have meant to anyone reading over her shoulder. First lie, egg floats true. It was, she would come to understand over the following months, the single most important habit the whole venture would ever ask of her, more important even than the boiling itself, because lye that ran too weak wasted good tallow on soap that would never fully set, and lye that ran too strong could scorch a batch into something no honest customer would want anywhere near their skin. The egg was patient with her in a way that people were not. It did not laugh. It only told her the truth, floating or sinking every single time she asked it. She tested a second crock 2 days later, once the hopper had drained a fresh charge fully through, wanting to know whether the first result had been luck or method. It floated exactly the same thumbnail's width of shell riding clear of the surface, and she felt something settle in her chest that had nothing to do with the lie itself, and everything to do with trusting her own hands again after a long winter of trusting mostly her own worry. A method that worked once might be an accident. A method that worked twice, tested the same careful way both times, was something closer to a fact, and Vesta Cole had always found facts considerably easier to build a plan around than hope. Word of the ash hopper reached Wendell Sharp's store roughly a week after Hollis Dre bored the drain hole, which was about as fast as anything traveled in Salt Fork that wasn't carried by a galloping horse. Vesta had gone in on a Thursday to make her regular payment against the account. $1.10 that week, hard-won across 4 days of washing for the Drover's Rest and 2 private houses. And Sharp had entered it in his ledger with the same unhurried, exact hand he used for every transaction in that store, then set down his pen and looked at her over his spectacles in a way that told her the conversation was not quite finished. "I hear you've got Hollis Dre building you some manner of barrel contraption out back of your place," he said. "Ash and drippings is what I hear. My wife's cousin lives 2 doors from you, in case you're wondering how word travels that fast." "It's an ash hopper, Mr. Sharp. For lye." "For lye." He said it the way a man repeats a word he suspects is a joke at his own expense. "And what does a laundress want with a barrel of lye water, if I might ask, seeing as you're already paying me good money for soap most every week of the year?" She had thought, more than once in the 2 weeks since she'd started filling that barrel, about exactly how she would answer this question the first time someone in town put it to her plainly, and she had decided, standing now in front of the man who held her $22.50 of debt in his own ledger book, that the honest answer was also the simplest one. I mean to make my own soap, Mr. Sharp, and sell what I don't use myself." Sharp was quiet for a moment. He was not, in the ordinary run of things, an unkind man. He had carried her account through 2 slow winters without ever once threatening to close her book the way some storekeepers would have, and he had never spoken sharply to her the way Grover Tice and his benchmates did for sport. But he was, above everything else, a man who dealt in freight schedules and wholesale prices from Kansas City, and the idea of a woman boiling soap in her own dooryard to compete with goods that came in by the crate on a manufacturer's account struck him visibly as somewhere between charming and absurd. "There's a reason soap comes up from the city in a wagon, Miss Cole, same as coffee and calico. It takes proper works to make it right. Kettles, presses, men who've done nothing else their whole working lives. I don't say it to be unkind. I say it because you got $22.50 standing against your name, due whole on the 1st of November, and I'd rather see you spend April through October earning toward that than boiling fat in your own yard on a notion out of a girlhood memory." Vesta let the observation sit a moment before she answered it, the way she had learned to let most of Sharp's pronouncements sit, because he was not a man who appreciated being interrupted mid-thought, even by a fair point. "May I ask what it costs you to freight a case of soap up from Kansas City, Mr. Sharp?" "More than I'd like," he admitted. "Though I don't see what that has to do with your ash barrel. Only that I mean to find out whether it costs less to make a thing than to haul it 400 miles, she said. "I don't expect you to take my word for the answer. I only ask that you let me show you once there's something to show." "I understand the note comes due the 1st of November, she said. "I intend to have it paid before then in full. I only mean to pay part of it in soap money instead of wash money, once there's soap to sell." He studied her a moment longer, the way he studied a column of figures he suspected might not balance, and then he shrugged, not unkindly, and told her that her credit was her own business to spend as she saw fit, and that he wished her well of it in the tone of a man who fully expected to be proven right and took no particular pleasure in the prospect. The rest of the store had been listening, as the rest of the store generally was. Agnes Rook, waiting at the counter with a length of blue gingham over one arm, allowed that she'd heard tell of women out east making their own soap, though she'd always understood it was the sort of thing you did when you truly had no other choice, not the sort of thing a body took up by choice when there was a perfectly good store 2 streets over. Grover Tice, who happened to be leaning against the doorframe with nothing better to do that afternoon, offered that he'd sooner drink the ash water than wash with anything that came out the far end of Vesta Cole's barrel, which drew a laugh from the 2 men nearest him, and no reaction whatsoever from Vesta, who paid for a paper of pins she genuinely needed, thanked Sharp for his patience, and walked home along Front Street with the particular flat, contained expression that Salt Fork was slowly, without quite realizing it, coming to associate with her. Not every voice in the store that afternoon leaned toward mockery. Corwin Lutz, who had come in for a sack of coffee and caught the tail end of the exchange, remarked, mild and unbothered, that he didn't see the humor in a woman trying to save herself $4 a year, and that he'd sooner sell his trimmings to somebody with a plan for them than watch them go to Hollis Dray's hogs for the rest of his working life. It was not a ringing endorsement. Lutz was not given to ringing endorsements of anything. But it was enough, said plainly in front of Agnes Rook and Grover Tice both, to take a little of the edge off the afternoon, and Vesta noticed it and did not forget it. She kept careful account of what the venture had cost her so far, because that was the only argument she entirely trusted. 17 cents for the barrel's drain hole and the scrap lumber for its cradle. 12 cents, then 18 more the following week, for pails of waste fat from Lutz's. Nothing at all for the ashes, which was the whole point of them. A dime for a fresh ball of stout cord to hang the crock steady beneath the drip hole after the first one had slipped and nearly spilled a morning's lie into the dirt. 2 cents for a paper of pins that had nothing to do with soap at all, but that she recorded anyway, because a ledger that only told the flattering half of the truth was not a ledger she could trust. 59 cents in total, against a debt of $22.50, and not one finished bar of soap yet to show for any of it. She was not discouraged by the arithmetic. She had expected going in that the early weeks would look exactly like this. Small sums going out, nothing yet coming back, because that was simply the shape every real thing took before it started paying for itself, whether anyone standing on a store porch laughing understood that or not. What she needed now was fat enough and lie enough to make a proper trial batch, and the nerve to boil it without flinching the first time the kettle over her fire began to smell like something out of her grandmother's yard 15 years and 400 miles gone. She thought, walking home that afternoon, of her father, long dead now, who had run a small dry goods counter in the Missouri town she'd grown up in, and had told her once, the only piece of business advice she could remember him ever offering directly, that the surest way to lose an argument with a doubtful customer was to argue at all. You simply kept the shelf stocked, kept the prices fair, and let the customer's own second visit make your case for you. She had been perhaps 13 when he told her that. She had not expected at 13 that the customer she would eventually need to convince would be an entire county, or that the shelf in question would be a set of slatted racks in her own lean-to. But the principle, she found, held up perfectly well regardless of scale. She had 6 pails of waste fat cooling in a covered crock behind her kitchen, better than 2 gallons of tested lye standing ready in a second crock beside the hopper, and a debt with a due date written into 2 separate ledgers now, hers and Wendell Sharp's. 6 months and change stood between the second Tuesday of April and the 1st of November. She intended to use every week of it. Rendering, Vesta discovered inside her first hour at it, was the least glamorous work she had ever put her hands to, which was a genuine distinction for a woman who made her living over a washtub. Waste fat, straight from Corwin Lutz's cutting room, could not simply be melted and poured into a soap kettle. It carried, mixed through it, thin threads of lean meat, bits of membrane, and a general uncleanliness that would sour into rankness within weeks if she tried to use it as it was, ruining the finished soap's smell and, worse, its keeping. Rendering was the work of boiling that roughness out. She cut the fat small, into pieces no bigger than a walnut, packed it into her big iron wash kettle with enough water to cover it by a few inches, and set it over a slow fire in the yard, because a hot, hurried fire scorched fat before it had melted through, and scorched fat carried its burnt smell into everything made from it afterward. A lesson she learned the plain, expensive way on her second attempt, when she left the fire untended a quarter hour too long, chasing a hen out of her bean rows, and came back to find 6 pounds of good rendering fat gone dark and bitter-smelling on the bottom of the kettle, fit for nothing but the compost heap. 12 cents of Corwin Lutz's fat, thrown away for want of watching a fire, and she wrote the loss into the ledger that same evening without softening it. Scorched render, 6 pounds. Total loss. She did not make that mistake twice. The right way she learned by watching her own kettle more carefully than she watched almost anything else in her life that spring was slow and patient. The fat melting down gently into the water, the clean liquid tallow rising pale and golden to the top, while the coarser matter, the bits of lean, the membrane, the small impurities that had ridden along with every pail from Lutz's, either sank to settle at the bottom or could be skimmed off the surface with a flat wooden spoon as it rose. Once it had cooked long enough that no more scum came up no matter how she skimmed, she strained the whole kettle through a clean cloth into a fresh vessel and let it stand overnight to cool. In the morning, the clean tallow had hardened into a solid pale cake floating free on top of the settled, cloudy water beneath it, lifting away in one piece at the touch of a knife, smelling of almost nothing at all, which was exactly the point. She did this 3 separate times with the same fat, melting the cake down again each time in fresh water and skimming it clean again, because her grandmother's rule, as best as Vesta could recall it, had been that fat rendered once was fat for cooking, and fat rendered 3 times over was fat clean enough for soap that a person would actually want against their skin. Each render pulled a little more of Corwin Lutz's meat market out of the tallow, and left a little more of nothing behind, until what she finally lifted out of that third cooling was as pale and blank and odorless as a cake of beeswax. The work itself settled, over those weeks, into a rhythm she came to recognize almost as well as wash day's own rhythm, the low fire built early, before the day's other chores crowded in, the patient watching that could not be hurried no matter how many other things waited for her attention, the particular warm, faintly meaty smell that clung to her hair and her sleeves on rendering days, no matter how carefully she worked. A smell she had stopped minding by the second week and had, by the third, come to associate less with butchering than with the plain, steady accumulation of something worth having. She rendered in the mornings, before the heat of the day made standing over a fire miserable, and spent her afternoons on washing and errands the way she always had, the 2 trades running alongside each other now rather than one crowding out the other, because she had learned quickly that a rendering fire wanted tending in short, frequent visits rather than one long, uninterrupted watch, and that she could, with practice, keep both fires, the wash copper and the rendering kettle, going within calling distance of each other on the days that demanded it. It took her the better part of 3 weeks, working rendering days in between her regular wash days, to build up 16 clean pounds of finished tallow, cake by careful cake, wrapped in cloth and stored in her coolest cupboard against the coming boil. 16 pounds did not sound, said aloud, like very much to show for 3 weeks of extra fire tending on top of a full laundress's trade, and she said as much to no one, because there was no one in Salt Fork she trusted yet to hear it without smiling. While she worked the renders, she kept the ash hopper running steady, refilling it twice more with fresh hardwood ash as the first charge went spent, and by the middle of May she had close to 4 gallons of tested lye, standing ready in covered crocks along the shady side of her kitchen wall, enough, she judged, for a real batch, not the pint-sized trials she had been running to prove the method to herself. She tested every fresh crock the same careful way. The egg first, the feather second, adjusting a weak batch by running it back through a fresh charge of ashes, thinning a batch that ran too strong with a measured cup of clean water until the egg settled back to riding just right, that thumbnail's width of dry shell above the surface that her grandmother had always called, in the only bit of poetry Vesta ever remembered the old woman using. Strong enough to bite, not strong enough to swallow. Once, in the second week of May, a fresh crock ran strong enough that the egg all but stood on end, riding nearly its full length clear of the surface, and she diluted it back with measured cups of clean water until it settled to the mark she trusted, grateful even then, before she had boiled a single real batch, that the test had caught the trouble before the trouble had cost her anything more than a few minutes' patience. Cressa Dre stopped by more than once that May, ostensibly to collect a basket of mending, and stood watching the ash hopper's slow drip with open curiosity that she did not bother disguising as anything else. "Hollis says you've got the whole thing running like a proper works already," she said one such afternoon, nodding at the crocks lined along the kitchen wall. "I wouldn't go that far yet," Vesta said. "I've made exactly nothing so far, ashes and fat and a great deal of watching." "That's most of what a proper works is, far as I can tell," Cressa said, and left it there, though she came back the following week anyway, and the week after that. By the third week of May, she had 16 pounds of clean, pale tallow, 4 gallons of properly tested lye, a debt of $22.50 still standing unmoved against her name, and every reason in the world, by her own reckoning, to believe she was finally ready to boil her first real batch of soap. She built her fire early on a still Monday morning at the end of May in the cleared patch of yard beside the ash hopper where she did her laundry boiling most weeks of the year, and set her big iron wash kettle over it with 16 pounds of clean tallow melting slow inside it while she waited for the fire to settle into the kind of steady, moderate heat that would not scorch a second batch the way the first one had. When the tallow had gone fully liquid, she began adding the lye, a dipperful at a time, stirring without pause as she poured, watching the two liquids, one pale gold, one the color of strong tea, fight each other for the first several minutes the way her grandmother had told her they always did, the mixture clouding and separating and clouding again before it finally began. Slowly, to come together into something new. She stood over that kettle for the better part of 5 hours that day, feeding the fire just enough to keep the boil steady and no more, stirring with a long wooden paddle worn smooth from years of laundry work, watching the color deepen and the texture thicken from something like buttermilk into something like honey, and then, toward the middle of the afternoon, into something with real body to it, a batter that clung to the paddle rather than sliding off. Her arm ached by the third hour in a way no wash day had ever quite matched, a deep, steady burn through the shoulder that came from stirring without pause rather than the shorter, harder bursts of laundry work, and she switched hands every 20 minutes or so to spread the strain, never once setting the paddle down entirely because she had been warned. By the one piece of her grandmother's instruction, she remembered word for word that a mixture left untended even briefly during the working boil could separate again and cost her the whole afternoon's progress. The sun climbed and the fire held steady, and the smell off the kettle changed twice more before the afternoon was through, from something sharp and faintly medicinal in the early going to something rounder and less insistent as the boil wore on. A sign, she would come to learn across many boils afterward, that the fight between the lye and the fat was gradually being won. She had been told, and had turned the telling over in her mind so many times that spring it had worn a groove, that the mixture would tell her itself when it was ready, that if she lifted the paddle and let a thin stream drizzle back across the surface, a properly cooked batch would hold that trail for a moment, visible, before settling back level, rather than vanishing the instant it touched down. She lifted the paddle at 4 different points that afternoon and drizzled, and on the 4th try, close to 2 in the afternoon, the thin ribbon she drew across the surface sat there, faint but real, for the better part of 3 full seconds before the surface swallowed it back level. Trace, she told herself. That was Trace. She had reached it. She stirred in a full cup of coarse salt then, the way her grandmother always had at this stage, watching the mixture change again almost at once, grainy curds of soap beginning to separate and rise through the thinner, cloudy liquid beneath. The spent lye, her grandmother had called it, good for nothing further but scrubbing a rough plank floor. She ladled the risen curds, careful and unhurried, into a wooden box she had built and lined with clean cloth for exactly this purpose, packed them firm, and left the whole thing to cool and set overnight under a heavy cloth in the coolest corner of her kitchen. By the following afternoon, the slab had firmed enough to turn out of its box and cut. She used a length of taut wire drawn straight down through the Pail block, the way she had seen her grandmother do it, and stood back with something close to pride at the sight of 31 bars of pale, faintly golden soap laid out in neat rows on a clean board, more soap all at once than she had made or seen made in 15 years. The trouble did not show itself for the better part of a week. She had set the bars on slatted racks in the dim, dry lean-to off her kitchen to begin their cure, and had gone back to them on the 3rd day and the 5th, running a thumbnail across the surface of first one bar and then another, the way she imagined a person judged such things, and had felt each time a faint give beneath her nail that she told herself was only to be expected this early in the process. By the 8th day, the give had not lessened. If anything, a thin film of oil had begun to sweat out along the top of several bars, and when she pressed a fingertip firmly into the corner of the nearest one, it left a print that did not spring back. She stood over that rack a long moment with her thumbnail still resting against the soft corner of the bar, feeling something considerably heavier than simple disappointment settle into her chest. She had not expected, going into that first real boil, that it would succeed on the very first attempt. She was not a foolish woman, and she had budgeted, in the part of her mind that budgeted for everything, some real chance of failure into the whole Springs plan. But budgeting for a thing in the abstract and standing in front of 31 ruined bars with your own fingerprint pressed into the corner of one were two entirely different experiences, and she allowed herself, for perhaps the length of one long breath, the plain feeling of it before she reached for her ledger instead of her own discouragement. She did not need her grandmother or anyone else to tell her what that meant. The batch had not fully become soap. Somewhere between the lie and the fat, the marriage her whole method depended on had not been struck all the way through. Either the lie had run weaker in the kettle than the egg had promised her that morning, thinned by her own nervous hand, adding a little extra water partway through the boil to calm a mixture that had briefly looked, to her worried eye, like it was running too fierce, or the fat itself had carried some last trace of uncleanness through all three renders that had slowed the reaction from finishing its work. Whatever the precise cause, the plain fact sitting on her drying racks was 31 bars of soft, greasy, half-made soap that would neither harden with time nor hold up to a single hard wash, worth, by her own honest reckoning, entered into the ledger that night, very close to $3 in wasted tallow, lye, and salt, and a full month of shelf space in her lean-to given over to something she could not in good conscience sell to a single soul in Salt Fork. Word of it reached Front Street inside 3 days. The way word of anything went wrong for Vesta Cole always seemed to travel faster than word of anything going right. She had mentioned to Corwin Lutz in an unguarded moment of genuine excitement the week before that her first real batch was curing and looked promising, and Lutz, meaning no particular harm by it, had mentioned the same to a customer who had mentioned it to another, until by the time the story reached the bench outside the feed store, it had taken on the shape these stories always took by the time they reached that bench. Grover Tice made a point of catching her on Front Street to ask, with real relish, whether it was true that Vesta Cole's soap wouldn't even hold its own shape on a shelf, and whether she meant to sell it as soap or as something to grease a wagon axle, an observation he clearly considered the finest joke he had made in weeks, and repeated, with small variations, to at least 4 separate people before the day was out. "Heard your soap won't even set up hard, Miss Cole," he called across Front Street, the second time he caught sight of her that week, loud enough that 2 women coming out of the harness shop turned to look. "My granddad always said a thing that won't harden ain't worth the fire it took to boil it. Might want to try again, or might want to admit some things are better left to men who've done it before." She did not answer him. She had already decided, walking home from the store the week before, that answering Grover Tice cost more than it ever returned. Vesta heard about most of it secondhand, from Cressa Dre, who reported it with visible reluctance and a great deal more sympathy than amusement. She did not go looking for the rest. She had 31 soft bars to deal with, and dealing with them, she had already decided, mattered a great deal more than answering Grover Tice. She spent 2 evenings that week working out, on paper, exactly where the batch had gone wrong, laying the whole process out in her ledger step by step, the way she laid out every failure she meant to actually learn from, rather than simply survive. The lie, she wrote, had tested true that morning. The egg had floated exactly right. But she had added water partway through the boil out of nerves rather than necessity, thinning a mixture that had needed to stay strong the whole way through, and the fat, rendered 3 times, might still have wanted a 4th pass. Corwin Lutz's trimmings, she reasoned, carried more variation than a farm's own home-killed hog fat would have, coming as they did from whatever animal had gone under his knife that particular week. and she resolved to render everything a full 4 times going forward, rather than trust her own eye to tell her when the cake had finally gone clean. 2 lessons, 31 ruined bars and close to $3 gone against a debt that had not moved an inch. She did not throw the failed batch out. She melted it back down gently in a fresh kettle, tested a new charge of lye to run through it a second time, and began again. Because the one thing Vesta Cole had never once done, in 29 years of being laughed at by people who had never had to make a debt come out even, was let a single failure be the last word on anything she had decided to finish. The second attempt taught her the other half of the lesson, and taught it fast. Determined not to run weak again, she added the fresh lye to her remelted batch with a heavier hand than she had the first time, reasoning in the confidence of a woman who has just diagnosed one mistake and is certain she has therefore solved it, that if too little lye had cost her 31 soft bars, more lye could only help. It did not help. The mixture reached what looked like trace faster than she expected, inside 2 hours rather than 5, and something in that speed should have warned her, but she poured it into the mold anyway, cut it the next day, and set the new bars on a scrap of clean toweling to test before she trusted them anywhere near the curing racks. She knew within the hour that this batch was wrong in the opposite direction. A bar left sitting against the damp toweling had eaten a faint, rough scorch into the cloth by evening, the way a hot iron might. And when she touched a fingertip to the cut edge of one bar, careful and testing rather than careless, it left a sharp, stinging warmth against her skin that lingered longer than any ordinary soap had a right to. She held her hand under the pump for a full minute afterward, more out of caution than real necessity, watching the sting fade slowly rather than all at once, and thought, standing there with cold water running over her own fingers, of every bar of manufactured soap she had ever bought from Sharp's shelf without once wondering what might have gone wrong in its making, and of how easily an unfamiliar customer's hand, rather than her own careful, testing one, might have met that same bar first. Lye left uncombined and unspent in a bar of soap did not forgive a wash-day hand the way a properly balanced bar did. It bit at the skin, dulled and yellowed good linen over repeated washings, and was, by any honest measure, not something she could hand across a counter to a single customer in Salt Fork with a clear conscience. She had gone from a batch with too little lye to a batch with too much, and the ledger entry that evening was short and unsparing. Second attempt, overstrong, unsellable, 9 bars, 60 cents. Hollis Dray, stopping by that same week to check on the ash hopper's second charge, looked at the 9 ruined bars laid out on their scrap of toweling, and offered the only comment he made on her method all spring, that a man who'd cured his own hides long enough learned the same lesson eventually, that too much of a strong thing did as much damage as too little of it, and that the trick, in hides same as soap, was never finding the strong end or the weak end, but the narrow stretch of ground in between, and holding it. 60 cents was a smaller wound than $3, and she noted with the closest thing to satisfaction the week had offered her, that it was a smaller wound precisely because she had caught it fast, tested it honestly against her own skin before ever letting it near a paying customer, and thrown it out before it cost her a single customer's trust. Between the 2 failures, she now understood the shape of the whole problem the way no amount of watching her grandmother as a child could ever have taught her. Too little lye left fat unspent, and the soap soft and greasy forever. Too much left lye unspent instead, and the soap harsh enough to burn. Somewhere between those 2 failures sat the exact balance her grandmother's old rhyme about biting and swallowing had been trying to describe all along, and Vesta understood now that the egg test was not a formality to be performed and then set aside. It was the one honest measurement standing between her and either mistake, every single time, for every single batch, for as long as she meant to do this work. She rendered a fresh 16 pounds of tallow that week, 4 careful passes through clean water this time, rather than 3, until the finished cakes came out so pale and so entirely without smell that she held one to her nose twice just to be certain there was nothing there at all. The 4th pass, she found, made a difference she could detect mostly by its absence. Nothing left to smell, nothing left to see clouding the cooling water, nothing but clean, pale fat settling into cakes so uniform she could have mistaken 1 week's rendering for another's without her own dated labels to tell them apart. She tested her lie with the discipline of a woman who had twice now paid for the alternative, floating the egg in every fresh crock before she trusted a drop of it near the kettle, adjusting patiently rather than nervously when a batch ran a shade too strong or too weak, never once again reaching for a cup of water mid-boil out of nerves rather than measurement. The 3rd boil, on a bright morning in the middle of June, went the way she had always hoped the first one would go. The tallow melted clean. The lye went in steady, a dipperful at a time, and the 2 liquids fought their brief early battle and then began, patiently, to come together. She stirred for the better part of 4 hours, watching the color and the weight of it change beneath the paddle, and when she finally lifted the paddle and drizzled a thin stream back across the surface, the trail sat there, clear and unmistakable, holding its shape for a long moment before settling level, not the faint, hopeful 3 seconds of the first batch, but something with real conviction behind it. She set the paddle down for the first time in 4 hours and simply looked at the kettle a moment, at the thick, pale, glossy surface that had finally, after 2 expensive lessons, done exactly what she had been asking of it since the last Sunday in April. It was not triumph exactly, standing alone in her own dooryard with no one there to share the moment. It was something quieter and, in its own way, more durable than triumph. The particular satisfaction of watching a thing you have built entirely out of your own patience finally agree to become what you always believed it could. She stirred in the salt, watched the curds rise and grain properly through the thinning liquid beneath, and ladled the whole batch, firm and glossy, and exactly the pale gold color she remembered from her grandmother's yard, into her waiting mold. She let it cure in the box 2 full days before she turned it out, longer than either previous attempt, out of a caution that had cost her enough by then to be worth keeping. When she finally lifted the set slab free and laid it on her cutting board, it held its shape the moment the mold came away, firm and solid under her palm in a way neither failed batch ever had. She drew her wire down through it in careful, even strokes, the way she had cut the very first slab back in May, and stood back to count 54 bars of hard, pale, faintly golden soap laid out in neat rows across her board. More bars at once than the entire failed spring had produced combined, and every single one of them, she was quite certain even before the curing weeks had begun to prove it, exactly what she had spent 2 months and nearly $4 learning how to make. She carried 2 of the fresh-cut bars, still faintly warm from the cutting, over to the dray place that same evening and set them on Cressa's kitchen table without much ceremony. Cressa turned one over in her hands, ran a thumbnail across it the way Vesta had taught herself to test a bar, and looked up with the particular grin of a woman who has been rooting for someone through a genuinely difficult stretch and is finally allowed to say so. "Well," Cressa said, "there it is then." "There it is," Vesta agreed, and for the first time since the 14th of April, allowed herself to believe it completely. 54 bars did not become 54 bars a person could sell simply because the cut had held. Hard soap, her grandmother's method insisted, needed time as much as it needed the right proportion of lye to fat. Not less than 5 weeks laid out on open slatted racks in a dry, shaded place, turned every few days so the air reached every face of every bar evenly, and 6 weeks if she could spare the shelf space, because the cure did 2 things at once that no amount of boiling could rush. It let the last of the water worked into the batch during boiling slowly breathe back out, hardening the bar from something dense and heavy into something light and firm that would last through weeks of hard washing, rather than melting away in a single afternoon at the tub. And it let whatever trace of lye remained, even in a properly balanced batch, finish combining itself fully with the fat over those quiet weeks, mellowing a bar that might sting a knuckle on its first day into one that was entirely gentle by the time anyone actually used it. A soap sold too early, however good the cut had looked coming out of the mold, was a soap that had not yet finished becoming what it was going to be. She built a proper drying shelf that June along the back wall of her lean-to, slatted boards raised on brick supports so air could move beneath every bar as well as above it. Hollis Dray supplied the brick supports from a broken load he'd been meaning to haul to the dump for a month, glad to see them put to use instead, and the boards themselves came from a length of shiplap left over from repairing her own back fence the autumn before, planed smooth on the top face so no rough splinter would mar a curing bar. It took her a single Saturday to build, considerably less trouble than the ash hopper had been, mostly because she now understood, in a way she had not in April, exactly what the finished thing needed to do, and had stopped second-guessing every board before she nailed it. She laid her 54 bars out in careful rows with a full inch between each one, turning them every third day, the way she turned the pages of her ledger, out of the same unhurried exact habit. She held back a third of the batch, 18 bars to cent, because plain hard soap was honest and useful and would always sell, but she had noticed, walking the dry hillside east of town, gathering ashes one week in early summer, a wide stand of wild bergamot coming into bloom, its ragged lavender-pink flowers giving off a clean, minty, faintly citrus scent when she crushed a leaf between her fingers. The same plant she had seen once or twice, dried and hung in bundles from a rafter in her grandmother's kitchen. The hillside that week was loud with bees working the same blossoms she meant to gather, a low, contented hum. She stood inside for a moment before she began cutting, careful to leave enough of the stand untouched that it would come back thick again the following summer, rather than picking any single patch bare. She worked in the cool of early morning, before the heat brought the fragrance up too strong and the bees too active for comfortable picking, filling her apron with the ragged blossoms and a good measure of leaf. Besides, because she had learned, testing a small handful days before, that the leaf held the scent nearly as well as the flower, and cost her nothing extra to gather alongside it. She gathered an apronful, dried it slow in the shade of the lean-to, and worked the crumbled, fragrant leaf into the 18 bars while they were still soft enough from a light second, working to take it evenly through the whole bar rather than sitting only on the surface. The plain bars, she decided, watching the ledger figures she had already sketched out more than once that spring, would sell at 5 cents apiece, a full nickel under what Wendell Sharp charged for a bar shipped up from Kansas City. The scented bars, the ones carrying the clean bergamot fragrance clear through to the center, she priced at 8 cents, still 2 cents under Sharp's shelf price, and worth it, she judged, to anyone who had ever stood in a store and wished the soap smelled of something besides tallow and lye. By her own tallied reckoning, a plain bar cost her, all told, something under 1.5 cents to produce once she counted the fat, the ash hauling, the salt, and a fair fraction of her own boiling time, which meant a nickel bar returned her better than 3 cents of clear profit on a piece of soap the size of her palm, a margin she had never once, in 4 years of laundering other people's linens for wages, come close to matching. The 5 weeks of curing ran through the last of June and into the first days of August, and Vesta filled them the way she filled every week that spring and summer, with washing for her regular customers, with pails from Lutz's every Tuesday morning, now 6 pails some weeks and 8 others as her confidence and her kettle both grew steadier, with fresh charges of ashes worked through the hopper, and with a second batch, 40 pounds of tallow this time, boiled at the end of June with the same careful discipline that had carried the third batch through. No failures this time, no lessons paid for twice, only 91 more bars added to the drying racks, curing steady behind the first 54. Her first sale came before a single bar had finished its full cure, and it came, fittingly enough, from Cressa Dre, who had watched the whole spring unfold from close enough to know exactly what it had cost, and who arrived at Vesta's kitchen door on the first Saturday in August, asking plainly whether there was soap yet a person could actually buy. Vesta sold her 4 plain bars and 2 scented ones for 36 cents, the first money the venture had ever returned rather than spent, and wrote the sale into her ledger that evening with a satisfaction she did not try to hide from herself, even sitting alone at her own table. Word moved from Cressa Dre the way it always moved in Salt Fork, except this time it moved in Vesta's favor. To 2 of the women Vesta already washed for, then to a third who did not know her at all but had heard from a cousin that the bergamot soap smelled better than anything on Sharp's shelf and cost less besides. One of those customers was a young mother named Delphine Ostrander, newly arrived that spring with a husband trying his hand at a claim north of town, who bought 6 bars on her first visit and returned inside 2 weeks for 6 more, telling Vesta, with the particular bluntness of a woman raising 2 small children on very little spare cash, that she had done the arithmetic herself and worked out she was saving the better part of 30 cents a month buying from the dooryard instead of the store shelf. Money that went, she said, straight into a coffee can she was filling toward a proper cook stove. Vesta remembered the name and the reason both, and entered them, as she entered most things that mattered to her, into the ledger alongside the sale itself. By the end of August, she had sold, in small handfuls of 2 and 3 bars at a time, across a dozen separate small transactions, $4.10 worth of soap, almost exactly, she noted with a private, wry satisfaction, the same sum that store-bought soap had cost her out of her own pocket the winter before. The debt in Wendell Sharp's ledger stood, by the last week of August, at $11.40, brought down steadily all summer by washing money, and now, for the first time, helped along by a second river of coin that had not existed in April. 2 months remained before the 1st of November. She had 91 bars still curing on the racks behind 54 already sold or nearly sold, a working method she trusted all the way down to the egg floating true in every fresh crock of lye. And, though she did not yet know it counting coins alone at her kitchen table that evening, a general store owner 2 streets away who had begun, without quite admitting it to himself, to pay rather more attention to the little soap operation he had once dismissed as a notion out of a girlhood memory. Wendell Sharp came to his change of mind the way careful men generally do, which is to say slowly from evidence rather than all at once from persuasion. The first crack in his skepticism, though he would not have named it that way himself, came from his own wife, who had bought a half-dozen bars from Cressa Dre in early September without telling him where they came from, used them through 2 full weeks of the household wash, and remarked over supper one evening that whatever soap Cressa had gotten hold of lately worked better on ground-in trail dust than anything they'd stocked in the store all year, and cost, if Cressa's price held true across a full dozen, considerably less than what he was paying his own Kansas City supplier to ship the same weight of soap 400 miles by wagon. Sharp had asked, with the particular carefulness of a man who suspects he already knows an answer he would rather not hear, where exactly this soap had come from, and his wife had told him, and he had said nothing further on the subject for 3 full days. He came to Vesta's dooryard himself on a Thursday afternoon in the middle of September, examined her drying racks with the same unhurried, exact attention he gave his own store shelves, asked to see her ledger, a request she granted without hesitation, because a ledger kept honest had nothing to hide from anyone, and studied the itemized cost of a single bar of her soap against the wholesale price he paid for a shipped one, running the figures twice the way he ran every set of figures that mattered to him. 2 cents a pail for the fat, he said finally, half to himself. Ashes for nothing, salt, and your own labor, which I don't doubt is worth something, though you haven't charged for it here. He looked up from the ledger. You're making a bar of soap for under 1.50 cents, Miss Cole, and selling it for 5. 8 for the scented ones. He was quiet again, in the way she had learned over a long summer of small dealings with him, meant he was doing arithmetic rather than forming an objection. I've been paying 9 cents a bar wholesale for soap that cost me another freight charge on top just to get it here from Kansas City, and selling it at 10. You're offering me a better margin than my own supplier from a wagon I don't have to wait 3 weeks on every time the road turns to mud. I hadn't thought of it in quite those words, Vesta said, which was not entirely true but was true enough to say aloud. I'll want consistency, Sharp said, businesslike again now that the arithmetic had settled the question of whether to deal with her at all. A customer who buys a bar that lathers well 1 month and burns his hands the next won't buy a third time, from you or from me. I've built this store on consistency, Miss Cole, more than on any single bargain. You'll have it, Vesta said, and did not elaborate further, because she had already decided, somewhere back in the ruin of her second failed batch, that consistency was the entire point of every test she performed on every crock of lye and every render of every pail of fat. And she saw no need to explain to Wendell Sharp a discipline she had already paid, in coin and in mockery both, to learn the hard way. They settled the arrangement that same afternoon, sitting at her kitchen table with her ledger and his both open between them. Sharp would take 15 dozen bars a month, 180 in all, at 5 cents apiece wholesale, $9 a month running through the winter and beyond, so long as the quality held, and he would retail them at 8 cents, a full 2 cents under what he had been charging for the shipped soap, which he judged correctly, would move faster off his shelf for the discount and still leave him a better margin than he had ever managed on soap before. He did not offer to raise the price simply because it was hers, rather than a manufacturer's. He offered a fair number based on what the ledger in front of him actually showed, and Vesta, who had spent a hard spring learning to trust exactly that kind of number, shook his hand on it without asking for more. Vesta packed that first trial crate herself, 24 bars wrapped individually in brown paper and nested in clean straw against the jostle of 40 miles of wagon road, and stood in her own dooryard rather longer than the task required, watching Hollis Dre's wagon roll out toward the eastern road with a piece of her own work, riding inside it toward a town she herself had never once had occasion to visit. It was, she thought, watching the wagon shrink toward the tree line, a strange and not unpleasant feeling, sending something you had made with your own hands out into a world of strangers to make its own case for itself. Word of the arrangement reached Millard's Junction, a rail town 40 miles east, inside 2 weeks, carried there the way most useful news in Red Wing County traveled, on the wagon of a man who had a reason to be going that direction anyway. Hollis Dre ran a regular freight circuit to the junction every 3rd week, hauling hides and wool out and bringing back goods the Salt Fork stores couldn't get any other way, and he had offered, without much ceremony, to carry a trial crate of Vesta's soap along on his next run and see whether the storekeeper there, a careful, close-counting man named Ferris Whitlock, cared to sample it. Whitlock cared to sample it. He sent back, by Dre's return trip 3 weeks later, an order for 8 dozen bars a month at the same 5-cent wholesale price Sharp was paying, along with a note observing, in the dry language storekeepers used with each other, that he had never known a soap this cheap to also be this good, and would take more if she could make more. Dre reported on his return that Whitlock had made him wait a full hour in the store while he tested a bar personally against 3 others already on his shelf, cutting slivers from each and working them into a basin of water side by side, comparing lather and rinse and smell with the methodical seriousness of a man who did not care to be fooled twice by a traveling salesman's promises. He had, Dre said, looked almost personally offended to discover that the cheapest soap in the comparison was also, by a clear margin, the best of the 4. By the last week of September, Vesta Cole's ledger carried, for the first time since the 14th of April, more entries reading received than spent. The debt to Wendell Sharp stood at $6.10. Two towns, 40 miles apart, were buying her soap by the crate, and the last of the season's big trail herds had just begun crossing the shallow ford south of Salt Fork, bringing with them, as they always did, 100 exhausted men and several weeks' worth of trail-caked laundry that somebody in town was going to have to wash. The rain started on the 2nd of October and did not let up for 3 days. A slow, gray, relentless soaking that the Salt Fork River had no particular trouble absorbing until, on the third night, it did, rising 4 feet over its banks by morning and taking the low timber crossing on the freight road east with it. The same crossing every wagon out of the railhead had to cross to reach either Salt Fork or Millard's Junction, washed down to a scatter of broken planking that no loaded freight wagon would attempt for weeks. Vesta watched the river come up from her own back fence on the second night. The water already spread wide and brown across the low ground south of town, carrying with it fence rails and a good deal of somebody's cordwood and, once, unnervingly, an entire chicken coop riding the current with what appeared to be its roof still intact. The sound of it reached her even over the wind, a low, steady roar entirely unlike the shallow river's ordinary summer murmur, and she stood at her fence a long while that second night simply listening to it, the way half of Salt Fork seemed to be doing, drawn outdoors by weather too large to ignore even from the warmth of a kitchen. Wendell Sharp's next shipment of manufactured soap, due up from Kansas City in the middle of October, sat somewhere on the far side of that broken crossing along with half the freight bound for Red Wing County that season, and there was nothing to be done about it but wait for the water to drop and a work crew to rebuild the crossing, which Sharp, checking with the freight office by wire, was told plainly would take 3 weeks at the soonest. His own shelf, drawn down all summer by the discount he'd been giving Vesta's soap the edge to compete against, held exactly 11 bars of shipped stock when the water rose, and 11 bars were not going to survive a single ordinary week in Salt Fork, let alone the week that was actually coming. Because the same rain that took the crossing also marked, almost to the day, the arrival of the season's last big herd. 1,900 head pushed north out of Texas under a trail boss named Amory Fitch, camped at the ford south of town waiting for the water to drop enough to cross his own cattle, with 18 men under him who had been 6 weeks on the trail and owned, between the lot of them, a mountain of shirts, socks, and bedding that had not seen honest soap since well before the Kansas line. Fitch's crew had crossed 4 rivers and 2 dry stretches getting this far, and their gear showed every mile of it. Shirts stiff with a summer's accumulated dust and worse, bedrolls that had not been properly aired in a month, socks that several of the younger hands had simply abandoned rather than continue wearing. It was, by any laundress's honest reckoning, about as difficult a wash as the trail ever produced, and exactly the kind of order most town laundresses dreaded seeing ride in, because it meant days of the hardest, dirtiest work at the tub for a crew that would be gone again within a week, regardless of how well or poorly the job got done. And the same week, as it happened every year without fail, whatever else was or wasn't happening in the wider world, was the week Salt Fork's households did their last big wash before the weather turned serious, the one all the women of the town treated by old habit as the real closing of summer. Vesta had not planned for a flood precisely because no one plans for a flood. But she had planned, all through September, for exactly this shape of crunch, the way she had come to plan for most things that year, by looking hard at a pattern until it told her something useful. The freight road east of Salt Fork crossed low ground for 6 miles before it reached higher country, and she had noticed, asking around without much apparent purpose, that it had washed out twice in the 4 years she'd lived in Red Wing County, both times in the first weeks of October, both times for the better part of a month. Trail herds, she also knew, without exception, arrived filthy and left fast, their crews needing a hard wash in the narrow window before they pushed on to the railhead. And wash day, the whole town's wash day, came every year the first cool week after the last herd cleared, as regular as the frost. She had, without ever quite calling it a strategy out loud to another living soul, held back the better part of her September production, rather than sell every bar the moment it finished curing. 130 bars sitting on her racks by the 1st of October, cured, ready, and entirely unclaimed by either standing contract, because some plain instinct born of a whole year of watching this county's patterns had told her that October was not the month to run her shelves bare. Sharp came to her dooryard himself on the 6th of October, hat in hand in a perfectly literal sense, the water still standing in sheets across the low pasture behind her fence, and asked, without any of the careful hedging he'd used back in April, how much stock she had ready to sell him beyond what their standing arrangement called for. 130 bars, she said. Cured, ready, on the racks now. I'll take every one of them, he said, at your price, not mine, and I'll pay you on delivery rather than waiting on the month's end, if that suits you better. It's your price now regardless, Mr. Sharp, Vesta said. It always was. I only ever asked you to look at the ledger and decide for yourself, back in April. He allowed himself something close to a rueful smile at that, the first she had ever seen cross his face in her presence. You did, he said. I recall it clearly. I believe I told you soap came up from the city in a wagon for good reason. You did tell me that. I was wrong about the wagon, he said, if not about much else, and left it there, which was, from a man as careful with his words as Wendell Sharp, very nearly a speech. It suited her considerably better. She counted out that same afternoon, delivering the stock herself with Hollis Dray's wagon, 90 plain bars at $4.50 and 40-cented ones at $3.20, $7.70 for the full 130, more than she had ever taken in across a single afternoon since the venture began. Amory Fitch rode into town 2 days later, once the water had dropped enough to let his crew cross for supplies, and found Sharp's shelves already thinning fast under the town's own wash day demand. He found his way, inside the hour, to Vesta's dooryard instead, on the recommendation of one of Sharp's own customers, and stood in her gate looking at the racks of Pail soap with the flat, assessing eye of a man who had spent 18 years buying supplies for trail outfits and had learned to recognize a fair price the moment he saw one. 18 men, he said, 6 weeks of trail dirt. I don't suppose you'd consider washing for the lot of us before we push north and selling me 24 bars besides for the road. She named him a fair price for the washing, 15 cents a dozen pieces, the same rate she charged any trail crew, and 5 cents a bar for the 2 dozen, the same price Sharp paid, because she had decided, somewhere in the exhausting middle of that spring, that she would rather be known up and down this cattle trail as a fair dealer than a clever one. The washing itself, when it came, was as hard as she had expected, and a little satisfying besides in a way she had not quite anticipated, working her own soap through her own tubs against 6 weeks of honest trail dirt, watching it cut through grease and grime as clean and complete as anything she had ever bought from a store shelf, at a fraction of what that store-bought bar would have cost her to use across 2 full days of heavy washing. She worked from before light both mornings, boiling and scrubbing and wringing until her arms matched the ache she remembered from her very first kettle of soap back in May, and delivered 18 men's worth of clean, dry laundry back to the trail camp on the evening of the second day, folded and sorted the way she folded and sorted for any customer, regardless of how briefly they'd be in her life. Fitch did not haggle. He paid her, over the 2 days his outfit camped at Salt Fork waiting on the ford, $9.40 for the washing and $1.20 for the soap, and told her, swinging back up onto his horse the morning his herd finally moved out, that he'd be looking for her soap again on his spring run north, whether the ford was washed out or not. Ferris Whitlock's rider reached Salt Fork from Millard's Junction on the 9th of October, having heard from a drover passing through the junction that Sharp's shelves stood empty, and Vesta Cole's did not, carrying an urgent request for 6 additional dozen bars beyond the standing order, which Whitlock needed, his note explained, because his own shipment had gone missing somewhere on the far side of the very same washed-out crossing. And on the 12th, a boy rode in from Antelope Springs, a town Vesta had never once done business with, 26 miles north along a different road entirely, carrying a note from a storekeeper there who had heard of her soap third hand from a freighter and wanted to know plainly whether she could spare 2 dozen bars and would consider a standing account going forward. Vesta did not know a single soul in Antelope Springs, had never once had occasion or reason to travel the 26 miles north to see it, and stood in her own dooryard reading that boy's note twice before she quite believed what it was actually asking her. A town she had never visited, carrying word of her soap third hand and fourth hand along a chain of freighters and drovers she could not have named if pressed, had decided, on the strength of a bar of soap somebody had happened to be carrying, that it wanted to do business with her directly. She wrote back that same afternoon, agreeing to the 2 dozen bars and the standing account both, and added the boy's fee for the ride to her ledger under a new heading she had not needed before that week. Antelope Springs, first order. She sat at her kitchen table on the night of the 14th of October with 3 separate piles of coin in front of her, counted and recounted the way she counted everything, and totaled, across that single remarkable stretch of 9 days, $21.90 in new money, enough, added to what already sat set aside against the debt, to walk into Wendell Sharp's store the following morning and pay the last $6.10 of her account in full, 17 days before the note was due, and still have real coins sitting clear in her own hand, the first true surplus of her adult life that owed nothing to anybody. Sharp entered the final payment into his ledger, without a word of surprise, because by then there was nothing left in the arrangement to be surprised about, closed her account book, and, after a moment's pause that she would remember for a long time afterward, said only that he supposed a woman who could make soap that good out of ash and garbage fat had probably known what she was doing back in April, whatever the rest of the town had thought at the time. It was not quite an apology. Vesta did not require one. She thanked him, folded the receipt into her own ledger between the entry for 12 cents and 6 pails and the entry for $21.90, and walked home along Front Street past the bench outside the feed store, where Grover Tice, for once, said nothing at all. By the following spring, 12 months almost to the week since she had first carried 2 pails of pale fat past a laughing bench on Front Street, Vesta Cole's dooryard bore very little resemblance to the small frame house with one cracked flour barrel that Hollis Dray had helped her raise in April of the year before. A second ash hopper stood beside the first, built that winter from a proper cooper's cask rather than a scavenged barrel, the two of them together able to keep pace with a kettle operation that now ran 3 full boils most months rather than one uncertain trial every few weeks. She had built a second larger kettle stand as well and had taken on help. 2 girls from town, paid a fair rate by the week to tend fires, turn curing racks, and cut finished slabs under her close instruction. Work Vesta oversaw the way Wendell Sharp oversaw his own ledger, exactly and without shortcuts. The 2 girls, sisters named Pearl and Junie Abbott, had come to her in November through their mother, a widow herself managing 4 children on very little, and Vesta had started them slow, on ash gathering and fire tending, before trusting them with a paddle at all, teaching the egg test to both of them the exact way her own grandmother had taught it to her, because she had come to believe, watching a full year of her own trial and error, that the test itself mattered a good deal more than any single person's memory of it, and deserved to outlive her own kitchen. Her drying shed had tripled in size, slatted racks running the full length of the back wall, and a second wall besides, holding, on any given week that spring, somewhere near 600 bars in some stage of their 5-week cure. Between the 3 standing accounts and her own direct dooryard sales, the works now produced on an ordinary month something close to 500 bars, a number that would have struck the Vesta Cole of the previous April as an outright fiction, spoken by someone who did not understand arithmetic at all. She still tracked every one of them by hand, still refused to sell a single bar before its full cure, still tested every crock of lye with an egg before trusting it near a kettle, because the size of the operation had changed a great deal in a year, but the standards underneath it had not moved an inch, and she did not intend to let them. Salt Fork stocked her soap. Millard's Junction stocked her soap, 144 bars a month now, rather than the original 8 dozen, Ferris Whitlock having raised his order twice over the winter without her ever once asking him to. Antelope Springs stocked her soap 26 miles north, the storekeeper there having become, by that spring, one of her steadiest accounts. Between the 3 towns, every general store within 40 miles of Salt Fork carried, on its shelves, soap that had begun its life as 2 cents worth of waste fat that Corwin Lutz had once paid a boy 50 cents a week to haul away. None of the 3 storekeepers had ever once asked her to lower her price, and she had never once been tempted to raise it simply because demand outran her racks some months. 5 cents a plain bar and 8 for the scented had proved, across a full year of testing, to be a number that left everyone in the chain. The butcher, the neighbors supplying ashes, the storekeepers, and Vesta herself, better off than the arrangement it had replaced. Corwin Lutz himself no longer sold his trimmings by the pail. He sold them by standing weekly arrangement, at a price they had renegotiated twice as her operation grew, and he had taken that winter to introducing her to out-of-town buyers who came through his shop as the only person in Red Wing County who ever made me money off my own garbage. A joke he told often enough that Vesta had long since stopped minding it, mostly because it was, by then, simply true. Grover Tice bought soap from her that spring, 4 bars at a time like anyone else, paid for in exact coin across her own kitchen table because she still sold direct to anyone who walked out to her gate, and never once in any conversation Vesta had with him afterward mentioned wagon axles or ash water again. He told her once, buying his 4 bars with the same exact coin he'd have used at Sharp's counter, that he supposed he owed her an apology for the business about the wagon axle, said half under his breath and not quite meeting her eye. "You don't owe me anything, Mr. Tice," she told him. "The soap's a nickel. That settles it same as it would with anyone." He seemed, if anything, more unsettled by her declining the apology than he would have been by her accepting it, and left with his 4 bars and a good deal more respect than he'd walked in with. He tipped his hat to her on Front Street now, the way he tipped it to any woman running an honest business in Salt Fork, and if there was anything sheepish in the gesture the first few times he made it, Vesta was gracious enough never to remark on it, because she had learned across a hard year that vindication did not need to be loud to be complete. It only needed to be true and counted, and entered in the ledger where anyone honest enough to look could see it. On a clear afternoon in late April, with the light going long and gold across the prairie the way it did at that hour, Hollis Dray's wagon stood loaded in her dooryard with 11 crates of soap bound for all 3 towns, pail bars packed tight in clean straw, the whole load catching the late sun, in a way that made even Vesta, who had by then seen several thousand bars of her own soap in every stage from raw fat to finished cake, stop a moment on her way past to look at it. She kept still, on a low shelf just inside her kitchen door, the 2 original pails Corwin Lutz had filled for her on that first Tuesday in April, battered now, one handle mended twice with wire, both of them long since retired from carrying fat and put instead to carrying finished bars out to the curing shed on cutting days. She could have replaced them a dozen times over, she never did. She told Cressa Dray once, and no one else, that she liked having them where she could see them, because it was easy, a year on, with the ledger running the way it ran now, to forget how small the beginning of a true thing was allowed to look. She kept, too, folded into the back cover of that same ledger, the small receipt Wendell Sharp had written out by hand on the 15th of October, marking the account paid in full 17 days ahead of its due date. Not because she needed the paper to prove anything to anyone any longer, but because a debt that had once felt large enough to shape every decision of an entire year deserved, she thought, a more permanent resting place than the back of her own memory. That ledger, the same cloth-bound book bought for 35 cents 4 years before its soap pages ever began, sat open on her kitchen table most evenings still, because success had not changed the one habit underneath everything else she had built. She still wrote down every dollar that came in and every dollar that went back out, still tested every fresh crock of lye with an egg before she trusted it near a kettle, still rendered every pail of fat the full 4 careful times regardless of how little patience a busy week left her for it. The numbers, a year later, told a story plain enough that she rarely needed to explain it to anyone who asked, though people asked less often now than they once had, laughter having given way, gradually and without any single dramatic mourning, to simple respect. 12 cents spent on 6 pails of waste fat on the 14th of April. $22.50 cleared 17 days early on the 15th of October. And in the months between, a hard spring of scorched renders and soft bars and a batch that stung like a live coal, each failure entered honestly. Each cost counted exactly, because she had come to understand, somewhere in the long middle of that difficult year, that the ledger's real value had never been the sums themselves. It was the discipline of looking straight at a thing, good or bad, and writing down exactly what it cost, rather than what she wished it had cost. She thought some evenings about how differently the whole year might have read if she had let the first failure, or the second, be the end of the account, rather than a single entered line within a much longer one. 31 soft bars and 9 caustic ones would have made, told alone, a perfectly reasonable story about a laundress who tried something ambitious and learned, the way most people eventually do, that some ideas are better left as memories of a grandmother's yard than revived in a woman's own dooryard. It was only the ledger, kept honest and read all the way to the bottom of the page rather than abandoned partway down it, that told the truer story. That a failure recorded plainly was not a verdict on the whole venture, only a single number waiting for the next entry to sit beside it. She had not, in the end, sold Red Wing County a bar of soap so much as she had sold it the plain, unglamorous fact of having looked hard at something everyone else had already decided was worth nothing at all. A pail of fat bound for the hog lot, a barrel of cold ashes bound for the trash heap, and asked patiently, one honest test at a time, whether that verdict was actually true. It rarely was, she had come to believe, though she was careful never to say so where it might sound like a boast. Most of what got thrown away in this world was not worthless. It was only unexamined, waiting on someone willing to pay it the attention nobody else had thought it deserved. Vesta Cole still rose before daylight most mornings, still walked to Corwin Lutz's back door on Tuesdays, still tended a fire under a kettle with the same unhurried patience she had brought to the very first one, because a year of proof had not made the work easier, only worth doing. The soap works stood a going concern now, its crates riding out across 40 miles of Kansas prairie to stores that had once laughed her name clean off Front Street, and the 2 battered pails still sat by her kitchen door where she could see them every single morning, a small plain reminder that the whole of it, the debt paid, the racks full, the men who no longer laughed, had started with 2 cents, and the simple willingness to carry something nobody else wanted all the way home. If this story found you tonight, wherever you're listening from, tap that like button before you go, subscribe if you'd like another true-to-craft story like this one next week, and tell me down in the comments what you think Vesta Cole ought to try her hand at next, because a woman who can turn waste fat and cold ashes into a fortune has, by every account in her own ledger, only just begun.